You're listening to A Second Look on the Orca. A Second Look is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on past events, unpack their significance, and discuss their long-term implications. A Second Look is intended to give thoughtful reflection on issues that made the headlines and elicited strong responses as a society. What did we think then? What do we think now? What have we learned? And now, your host, Justin Goodrich.
Welcome to this month's edition of A Second Look here on the orca.ca. I'm your host, Justin Goodrich. On this month's edition of A Second Look, we'll be taking a second look at the most recent U.S. presidential election, which saw President Trump defeated by former Vice President, now President, Joe Biden. Joining me on today's episode is Dr. Edward Akuffo. A professor of political science, Dr. Akuffo was one of my professors when I was doing my undergraduate degree in political science. In fact, it was because of him that I developed an interest in international security, ultimately completing my master's law degree in international criminal law. Welcome to the program, Edward.
Thank you very much, Justin, and thanks very much for having me here.
Well, it's an absolute delight. I consider it a tremendous privilege that we've had the opportunity to maintain our relationship and build a friendship over these years, and I'm delighted you're here today. So thank you.
Thank you too, Justin.
Let's get right into it. Since President Biden took office, how has the political discourse within the United States shifted?
That's a very interesting, question. The United States, as we all know, in the past 4 years, or perhaps we can say in the past 4.5 years, the political discourse was always, heated. It was heated, in the sense that it had to do with, some very sharp, divisions. You can really see that the U.S. society appeared to be, divided along not only ideological lines but also racial lines, among others. So the whole system was somehow charged. That is not to say that the U.S., as just like any other society, doesn't have its own challenges, doesn't have its own, divisions. In fact, the challenges and the divisions is the real essence of, politics. And as long as, it doesn't lead to any violent confrontations, that's the nature of politics, because politics by its nature is conflictual. It's conflictual in the sense that disagreements and arguments and all that help to create that environment for new ideas and opportunities, to crop up. So in the past 6 months, since after the elections, one could say that the political, rhetoric seemed to have calmed, down. Now, the reason why it has calmed down is that in the run-up to any elections in any part of the world, because it is competitive, and the U.S. actually showed us how competitive their elections could be. So the U.S. election was clearly very competitive, and it was heated. And rightly so, because there were deep divisions about, questions around race, questions around, migration, questions around what we all are dealing with around the globe, the pandemic, the COVID-19, pandemic. So it was quite heated. But now that a new government is in office, President Biden, a new administration is in office, President Biden has been in office, and President Trump is now, taking his well-deserved, perhaps, leave, if you might say, put it that way. It has really kind of, calmed down. And I think the former president has done quite well in terms of staying out of the political scene to allow this new administration to roll out, its policies. So that in itself seemed to have calmed, the situation. So in terms of, the shifts that have occurred, we could say that now is business in terms of, President Biden now has the Oval Office, and now he has the opportunity to roll out his policies and push U.S. Economy and its politics, forward.
Well, that was very, shall we say, diplomatic of you. with respect to how you framed the former exit or the exit of the former president now. And diplomacy is actually a great segue, Edward, because my next question to you is the impact of this new administration, specifically the impact on the bilateral relations between Canada and the United States. And the simple question is President Biden good for Canada?
That's a very that is also another important and interesting question. Is President Biden good for Canada? Now we need to this is the way I'm going to look and going to say it right from at the upfront. That is, every single government or every single state pursues its interest in the international arena. It is the primary or the fundamental things that states do. So President Biden is for the United States and Prime Minister Trudeau is for Canada. In fact, we may have mutual interest, but we may have interests that also do not align. Clearly, President Biden is pursuing the interest of the United States, just like the previous president did, in that as soon as he came to power, one of the things that he did, the executive orders that he issued, was the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline.
Right, very controversial.
Very controversial thing that he did. Now, the question is that will that be someone or a president who is for Canada or who is good for Canada? Now, I very well believe that if you speak to people of Alberta and you speak to the premier of Alberta, they are going to tell you that no, this is not good. This is not good for our friendship. This is not good for our economic relations. In fact, industry experts have argued that the cancellation of the pipeline itself, it's going to come back to bite the United States, because it's likely that in the future, oil prices are going to rise, and that the United States, instead of relying on oil from a friendly state, and not just a friendly state, but will you say that we can say that even a brother state, if I may put it that way, here, because we share close border with the United States. In fact, we have the longest border in the world. We share this long border of over 5,500 mile border with the United States. So by canceling this, and how friendly we are, democratic share similar values on human rights, on democracy, on the rule of law. We are great allies in NATO, with NORAD, and in the United Nations, as a whole. So we have very deep diplomatic relations with the United States. And by canceling this, the US will be forced then to go and buy oil from unfriendly and unstable societies or countries out there. So industry experts believe that if this should happen, prices of oil are going to rise in the future, because although we are making some progress to find alternative sources of energy, we are still not there yet to provide them in huge commercial quantities, where oil will get to the point where we say oil is no longer, or it's of limited value to our energy mix.
Right.
We haven't got there yet. So the US will have to rely on oil from other countries. Now that was the little bit about the Keystone pipeline, but we have seen some improvement regarding how the pandemic is being managed across the borders of the United States and Canada. For example, the Biden administration was generous, to share about 1.5 million or so AstraZeneca, vaccines, with Canada. And Canada became the second country after Mexico to receive Pfizer vaccines, which were produced in the United States. So this clearly shows that we are on good terms, or we are the relationship is good. But it is in the common interest of Canada and the US to always maintain friendly and good relations. The reason being that For Canada, over 65% of our trade is with the United States. Although this constitutes just about 5% or so of US, trade in general, but it is still a huge part of the US, economy. And therefore, it is important to maintain this deep, friendly relations. And of course, traveling of people across the borders. There are Canadians who are dual citizens with US, United States as one of, one of their national, where they are dual citizens, basically. So there is that relationship. And then you also have the travel, the tourism, and the hospitality industry, which benefits from movement of people across the borders. So yes, the US, in that regard, is good for Canada. But Canada has a responsibility, sole primary responsibility, and led by the Prime Minister, to make sure that Canada's interest is protected and is pursued within reasonable, if you will, limits, to ensure that we are secure in terms of security, in terms of the economy, human rights, among others.
Well, Edward, you bring so many valuable points to the table. Certainly, you've made it clear as to the general relationship between Canada and the United States, and the importance of a strong and healthy relationship between the two countries. You've also spoken to the duties of the different leaders at play, the different stakeholders. But you've also rightfully pointed out that, in answer to my question, is President Biden good for Canada? I suppose, as is in the case in most things, in all things, context is king. And so again, perhaps for Alberta, their views may be different than the rest of the province, and it's fair commentary. Fair commentary. I want to take things to the next level and go from sort of the bilateral Canadian American viewpoint to the more international discourse. And so my next question to you then is, how has the change in government in the United States impacted international relations and diplomacy? I've got my thoughts onto whether or not it's been a good thing or not, but I'll leave it to you as the expert to tell me how you believe the international community views this shift to President Biden.
I think it's but thank you again, for that brilliant, question. It is part of, international diplomacy, diplomatic, practice for governments to pay respect, or to recognize other governments, to recognize other leaders as and when they are elected into office. The election of President Biden, we saw that with statements from the Canadian Prime Minister, on behalf of Canada, from the UK, and among others. So these are the usual or the standard practice that goes on among friendly nations, to issue statements that congratulate or welcome particular leaders to office. On that level, one could make the argument that nothing really has changed, there. Now, what seemed to be a change, and here again, it is important to provide context, because you did mention, context. The previous president, Trump, clearly made his battle cry, or if you will, was "Make America Great Again." So he was basically not going to sit down for US interest to be trampled upon, because the United States has the strongest, economy the strongest and the largest economy in the world, if you will. It also has, the largest, military in the world. So you have money and you have guns. Man, you have power. You have lots of, power, and you can do almost anything that you want to do. But of course, states don't behave that way. Even the United States doesn't behave that way, because there are international norms that restrict the use of force and things, like that. So the former president clearly told NATO allies that you must pay up. If you don't pay up, the US was somehow going to withdraw from NATO. That was some kind of, a carrot, a stick, approach to try to get these NATO allies to pay up, because to him, the US, it was just unfair for the United States to bear the huge back cost of operating NATO's operational budget. When he did that, he got some response. Canada, for example, increased its contribution. Other NATO members also did that, and so he was able to get something out of that, if you will, threat that he issued. Now, from a diplomatic standpoint, and given the long relations between these Western powers, it clearly didn't sit very well that Trump should do that, kind of, rebuke them in public and things, like that. For example, in our own prime minister, he called him, a two-faced, person, which really break certain. It breaks norms about friendly relations between long-time, friends or allies. Now, so getting on that, the former president also canceled the Iranian, nuclear deal. He pulled the U.S., out of, the Paris climate change, the Paris climate agreement. He withdrew the United States from the World Health Organization because of U.S. Diplomatic, spat with, China relating to the COVID-19, pandemic. Now, since President Biden came to office, he has restored U.S. membership at the WHO. He has attended NATO summit about 2 weeks ago. He has also reinstated the United States in the Paris climate change, and closed door negotiations are ongoing to restore the Iranian nuclear deal from 2015. Now, all these tell us that there is a kind of a change. You will say that there is a more more friendly approach to these issues. In fact, President Biden says that America is back at the table. So if the United States is back at the table, then it means the United States is willing to cooperate with its allies to finding solutions to global challenges. But at the just G7 summit a week and a half or so ago, together with other G7 leaders, our own prime minister included, they issued statements regarding a global infrastructure strategy. They also talked about global anti-pandemic plan that will, and part of the plan is to reduce the period for developing vaccines to 100 days. As part of that plan as well, they are going to give out about $1 billion of vaccine doses to developing countries. And questions around climate change also has been taken seriously. So you can make the argument that unlike the previous administration, who wanted to use, if you will, sticks in order to somehow whip other leaders in line, Biden's approach has been more accommodating in terms of more collaborative. Indeed, he said that the G7 summit was extraordinary collaborative. So it is a more collaborative approach to finding global solutions to global challenges. So that in a nutshell is how one could describe the current international environment. But we still need to keep in mind though that in doing this, diplomacy is one thing in terms of the relationship, the nice talks, the beautiful things that are said, in public to calm public tension, for example. But it is also a different ball game when states' core interest is at stake. And on the basis of that, states sometimes will not agree. And that is where it can generate temporary disagreements, which sometimes can even be conflictual, if you will,
Sure.
in terms of being a little bit more intense. Yes.
Well, certainly, I mean, certainly it makes sense that various dynamics will always shape the essence of diplomacy, from trade policies to the personalities of those in power, and anything and everything in between. So I hear you loud and clear when you say, there are always times where things are a little bit more intense.
Yes.
What I so appreciated you articulating was the notion of carrot and stick, because though simplistic, it really it like anyone who hears that gets it, and I think
Yes.
that's very helpful for an otherwise very challenging conversation. Certainly, international relations is is filled with all sorts of dynamics. Um, my question to you then is this: I want to build off the carrot and the stick notion. If I heard you correctly, President Biden is the carrot. President Trump was the stick in terms of their approaches, and I wonder, do you think the Trump presidency is is has resulted in some reputational damage within international discourse, and if so, to what degree? And furthermore, how long will it take to mitigate it? Is it something that happens rather quickly when there's a changing of the guard, or will the US have several years ahead of them before they can perhaps regain some of their social and political capital within the greater world order?
That is quite an interesting, question.
It's kind of my job, to
Yes.
try and ask some interesting questions
Yes.
for our listeners. You've got the tough part answering them.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm going to try to do my best in providing a response to this question. In terms of reputational damage. Now, in terms of reputational damage, one could say that the relationship between our own Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Trump, President Trump, wasn't all that great, as from based on what was said, what we have all read, and all that. So there's some reputational thing out there. But what is important in the relationship between the United States and Canada is that this relationship goes far beyond a particular president or a particular personality in the Oval Office, or in the Prime Minister, in Canada. That it's a very deep, a very, very deep, relationship. Now, when President Trump became president, one of the very first people that he called was Prime Minister Trudeau. And that is in following, tradition. In fact, Trump also, did that. But clearly, one could say that it is not the case that Trump didn't say things to warn us about what was going to come. Because when he was campaigning, he made it very clear, make America great again. He told us, Canada, that he was going to renegotiate NAFTA. He said it. So for me, on the basis of that, he was predictable. He was predictable about the things that he would do. And, he was predictable with a stick and said that, you do that, and then we'll get along, nice. But, one thing that we can credit him, for which I think many scholars of international relations or observers of the US president politics in general of the United States will appreciate was the fact that his record in terms of the use of force or deploying large American military around the globe did not, happen. He didn't do that. He didn't initiate any new wars. In fact, he pulled out troops from Afghanistan. He pulled out, troops from Iraq. So on the basis of that, he was trying to rebuild the United States, economy. The United States, economy. He was able to get U.S. investors, to bring back their investment in the United States. And so on the basis of that, he did, a good, job. Now, so on that level, his reputation within the United States, as far as, his economic, record, it's, one could say that fair observers will say that he did a good job, in that area. Now, where he had a challenge was his tweets. I must say, his tweets. I think his tweets. Anytime I have conversations, with friends, I make this point that I think that what really it is his own words, which basically caused him harm. Now, his own words, the words that came out of his mouth, the words that came out of his fingers on his tweets, they are those, that caused him, harm in the elections. And of course, there was also questions around the pandemic, and all that. I think for the sake of politics, one could argue that the Democrats did a fantastic job of making him look as, clueless with regards to how he was handling, the pandemic, and that sat very well with the U.S. public, and they voted him out. So that reputational, aspect, relates to his performance. Now, how does that portray the United States, in the world? Now, the United States, in spite of those challenges, is still the most powerful country on this planet. Is still the most powerful state on this planet. On that basis, its reputation was not very much in doubt with regards to its power, the preponderance of its power. What the U.S. lost, had a way to repair is the diplomatic, aspect in terms of how the president conducts himself both in public and also in private. And perhaps one of the greatest, areas that the Biden administration needs to do a little bit more work is to restore trust with Western allies. And it appears that trust is now being restored based on the outcome of the G7 summit, where the president said that it was an extraordinarily collaborative. That is very good, for restoring U.S. U.S. credibility, U.S. interest. But it is also important to note that the restoration of that credibility will also depend on how this administration handle or deal with questions that Trump, was focused on, especially on immigration, because of what is happening in the U.S. southern border, right now. So some of the things that is happening right now is actually creating challenges for the United States, because now the outside world sees the U.S. as having a friendly president. So they have the opportunity now to come, that Biden is the president now, so we can now come, because we'll be wholeheartedly, welcome to the United States.
Right.
And if Biden institute any punitive, measures Now, he's not going to look good because it will appear, he will tend to appear like the same that the Trump, administration. Now, that is, that is the point. But if I may express this idea as well, states have a responsibility. Every government has a responsibility to secure its borders. It is the primary responsibility of every government to ensure the security of its people. So to the extent that Trump was tightening, the borders of the United States, he wasn't actually doing any bad thing. He was doing what was necessary. He was doing what was important. He was doing what was required to protect US citizens. And it is my expectation that in spite of the challenges that the current administration also faces, and which can have a kind of an international backlash because human rights organizations are going to pick on some of these things. But some of the images that are coming from the detention centers are very, very troubling. There have been cases of, sexual abuse of children and things like that. These are very, very troubling things, to hear and to see images of some of these things about deplorable conditions in which some of these migrants find themselves. But the president has a responsibility here. He is now sitting in the big chair in the Oval Office, and he needs to do what is necessary to protect human rights, but also to ensure that US borders are secured.
I think anyone listening to this podcast is probably going to be a little irritated because you're so balanced and you're so fair in your commentary that whether someone is ideologically left or ideologically right, you've given them no path other than the path towards neutrality and practicality and the role of government and the importance of a government preserving its own self-interests. And your arguments are so scholarly. I don't think anyone can get annoyed with you. But it's why you're the right guest for this particular episode. I am far more heated and far more passionate, and so you bring a balance to the conversation. I want to ask you one last question, and that's not necessarily political in nature, but certainly tied to political leadership. From my perspective, and many of those in my circles of influence, we see the United States as having been diminished reputationally by the actions of former President Trump. And we have seen, I think it's fair to say, an increase in, among other things, hate crime, or certainly rhetoric that is of a hateful and unkind nature. And so my last question to you, Edward, is: do you believe there are any long-term impacts from, let's call it, the Trump narrative, if you will? Do you think there are any long-term impacts on the United States? Or do you feel that this has sort of now boiled over, and under President Biden, the United States has an opportunity to perhaps go back to a more neutral discourse, and some of that hate can hopefully subside? Or do you think this is going to be a long and painful process?
That is, I think it's very interesting how the tables have turned here. So Justin Goodrich, my former student that I used to ask big and tough questions, and now throwing back big and tough questions, at me. This is fantastic. This is fantastic. This is fantastic. To kind of provide a response, to this question, today, something significant has happened in the United States. Derek Chauvin, who used his knee, pressed his knee against George Floyd, and who passed, away, was sentenced, today to 22 and a half years in prison. Now, this is significant for racial relations in the United States. It is significant in that it is setting a precedent that we should take human rights, or US citizens, or all of us around the planet should take human rights seriously and respect the rights of people, no matter who they are and where they come from. That it is very important. On the basis of that, one can say that US is turning a corner in terms of human rights of Black Americans and their relationship with the police. Now, having said that, I think it is very, very important that we don't only become preoccupied with the things that we see in the news or the things that we hear in the news, that we don't become preoccupied only by social media, whether tweets or Facebook or Instagram things that we see, but rather our attention should focus or should shift towards not the symptoms that we see, but the structural conditions within the United States and around the world that lead to some of the things that we see. Now, it is very important, I say this because leaders like Trump, as much as they may have lovers and haters, or there are people who hail them and there are people who basically boo them, it is important for us to understand that they are products of the same social and political structures that exist within society, whether it is the state itself or within the global arena. That human rights cannot be advanced and respected without a fundamental transformation of the economic, the cultural, and the political, or I will also add the religious, if you will, structures which permits abuses to endure. To the extent that people do not have jobs, to the extent that when people have completed their education and they are well qualified to apply for jobs, these jobs are not open to them. There are no transparency in hiring processes. To the extent that the judicial system is skewed towards, is biased towards particular group of people. All these things will engender human rights crisis from time to time. I am not in any way saying that these structural, deeply structural things can be removed or can be solved within a short time. But what I am saying is that our minds should not look at or focus on the symptoms of what we all are concerned about, but rather to focus on the structural embeddedness of some of these conditions within society. Because, like I've said it, in private, the fact is that there are American presidents that are going to have the persona of current President Biden that people will like and some people will dislike, regardless of his person or the way he approaches, the way he does things. In the same way, there are more American presidents to come in the nature of President Trump, whether people like him or dislike him. But what is important here is that society makes the frantic effort to address those things that we see as producing or reproducing conflict over time. And to the extent that we do not focus our attentions on those things, basically what is going to happen is that we will be back to the future, and the future is not going to look very different from what we are experiencing in the present.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, looking at the clock, we are in fact running out of time. So that does bring us to the end of this edition of A Second Look. I'd like to thank my guest Edward Akuffo for joining me. You know, by way of a final comment, consider this. And Dr. Akuffo spoke to it just a moment ago. At the end of the day, whatever happens in society, we all have a role to play. And only through making our voices heard, making our expectations clear, and addressing all the injustices we see around us, then and only then can we hope for a better and more just society. Until next time, I'm Justin Goodrich. Thanks for listening.
The preceding program was brought to you by Alliance Public Affairs Group in association with Van Grio. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode, please email us at asecondlook@theorca.ca. Thank you for listening, and please remember to like and share.